what is wealth and how is it created, right? These are some of the foundational questions of capitalism. And like most ideas do, it came to me while I was taking a shower. I was pondering the question that I heard recently on the news. Hey, the government needs to create more jobs. And I was like, what does that mean? Create more jobs? And can the government create more jobs? How does that work? And I remember thinking, I was like, okay, I had a business at the time, a country dance hall, two in fact, and I was employing about 15, 16 people at the time. And I was like, well, let's say that I had never had that idea. Would those 15 or 16 people have that job right now? No, they wouldn't. If I hadn't started that business, they wouldn't have that job. Okay. Well, what about the people? It was in a small town in St. George. It was in two towns in St. George. And this particular one didn't have any options to do dancing. And I said, well, what if I had never created that business in the first place? Would those people, all of those 1,000 members that I have, would they be able to go dancing? No, they wouldn't, because that opportunity had never been created, right? That's a form of wealth, opportunities that you can go and do. And I started backing up. I was like, okay, if I had never created this dance hall, that kind of takes away the opportunity from people going and saying, I want to do something with my weekday, let me go dancing. Same with, let's say, a movie theater that's in town. As the guy never starts that movie theater, me as a customer, no matter how much I want to go to the movies, I can't in that area because that opportunity doesn't exist. And I kind of just backtracked it all the way, and I could create a whole video just on this concept. I'm going to keep it simple here. I went all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? All the way back to the beginning. I said, okay, let's say Adam's there, and he's like, man, I have all the real estate in the world, right? It's all mine, okay? And I have all the gold and all the silver. Sure, it's yet to be mined and stuff, but it's still on my real estate. Real estate, just real estate alone is really valuable, right? Well, that's what you would think. Well, let's say that he's like, okay, I have all this wealth. I want somebody to build me a house. There isn't anybody to build him a house. He still has to build his own house. There isn't that form of wealth where he can trade something so that he gets a house instead. But then he starts having kids, and they start developing businesses. And one kid's like, okay, I want to go into the house building business, and I'll build houses for everybody. Another kid's like, I want to go into the food gathering business. I'm going to gather everybody's food. I'm going to go into this business. And then they start trading amongst each other for these goods and services. And so now I can say, hey, why don't you take this? I'll give you this plot of land, and in return, why don't you build me a house? And I'm going to give you this piece of land as well, and in return, you give me food as your let's say your mortgage. Every single month, you're bringing me food, and I start trading with other people, and in turn, that is wealth. That's how wealth is created. And if you don't understand this idea of what wealth is and how it is created, then this whole book, Empire of Wealth, doesn't make sense. And that's the book that we're reviewing today, is Empire of Wealth. Highly, highly recommend it to every single entrepreneur. And there are three main takeaways that I'm going to go over today. There's so many more things that you're going to get out of this book. It's 15 hours long of just straight stories going into all these amazing entrepreneurs and all these great things. But I'm going to cover three lessons. Number one, America, an empire of wealth, right? I'm just going to go ahead and read this because this is the intro that it gives at the beginning of the book. And it's better said. I read this to all my friends that I'm like, hey, you should read this book. I just read the intro for them. I don't read very many intros. But here it is. Throughout time, from ancient Rome to modern Britain, the great empires built and maintained their dominance through force of arms and political power, but not the United States. America has dominated the world in a new, peaceful, and pervasive way through the continued creation of staggering wealth. In this authoritative, engrossing history, John Steele Gordon captures as never before the true source of our nation's global influence, wealth, and the capacity to create more of it. And oh my goodness, I gotta go just so deep into that, because that's the root of America, is its wealth and its capacity to create more of it. So many nations throughout the entire history of the world, they all focused on just taking over land, but they never learned how to create wealth. Just like that example we gave of Adam and Eve in the beginning and all their kids, and they start creating businesses and they start trading with one another, and just keeps on going. That's the story of America. That's how America has become so wealthy, is because they understood how to create more wealth, and their laws were surrounded preserving that freedom to build businesses and protect those businesses, right? Lesson number 2 is even Christopher Columbus needed funding, right? Back it up a little bit. When they started first sending out voyages to go out to sea, the kings and queens, they were the only ones who could afford to send these ships to go out to new lands and discover new places, right? Well, what would happen is they would send a ship out, and they were personally liable for that ship. It was like they were personally signing for that ship to go out, and if it sank, then they were personally liable to the banks to cover that debt. So let's say that it was, I don't know, let's just throw out $100 million in today's money to send out a ship and all of its crew, and you end up losing 100 lives and all of that equipment and all the stuff for the bank. Now I'm personally liable to pay that 100 million back, and if I don't, then I go to jail, right? I'm punished for it personally. But here's the thing, is that they're like, man, this kind of sucks. I don't want to be personally liable for this, because it's not really me. It's really a business that's going to do it. I'm going to create this thing called a corporation. And they sent out these corporations, or not sent out these corporations, they created this corporation. And essentially, he talks about in the book in very great detail. And it was one of the biggest breakthroughs in business and in politics in thousands of years, because they were able to create a separate entity from the individual and say, this ship is under this entity's name, and this is liable. And if the ship went out and it sunk and nothing happened, well, then the entity was liable, and the entity had to pay back the banks. But if the entity couldn't, then you could dissolve that entity and say, hey, listen, that business didn't end up working out. Now the banks have to say, okay, if there's not a personal liability, somebody personally liable, there's a little more risk there, right? And they learn to deal with that. But separating a person from the business has been amazing. I'll give a simple example in modern day terms. You start up a business, and right, let's say that one of your employees goes out and steals a customer's car, right? Well, if you have a sole proprietorship, you are personally liable for that, and you have to pay back that customer personally. But if it's your company, if you have a corporation or limited liability company, which is another form of entity that was created later on, then you're not personally liable for that. It's your company that's on the hook, and you don't end up going to jail or to prison or having to pay those funds back, because it's your entity. It's separating you from the entity, right? Well, what happened was when they started creating that, then they were able to send out more voyages. More people wanted to send out the voyages because they weren't personally liable, and they were able to discover new lands. Well, discovering new lands isn't free, nor is it cheap, right? And they needed financing. And so the takeaway for me was even Christopher Columbus, he needed financing to go out and discover these new lands. The Queen of Spain said, here, I believe in you. I want to fund your voyage. And we do the same things today. If I want to start a business and it's very cost intensive, which thank goodness to technology, prices are coming down. The barrier to entry is coming down. Because imagine starting up a business where you're like, okay, the barrier to entry is $100 million. Well, that's going to be really hard. But there are still many businesses today that there is that barrier to entry, or I do need a lot of capital. And so I can go and seek funding from someone else, following Christopher Columbus's steps, and seek funding to get my business off and running, right? And lastly, takeaway number 3 is this book inspired me to think 1,000 times bigger, not 10 times, not 100 times, 1,000 times bigger, right? It gives stories of sailing ships across the sea when they're like, man, the sea, the world is flat. You're going to fall off the edge, right? That's adventure. That's taking it to a whole nother level. They were dredging out rivers to create canals so they could take supplies from one city to another city inside of the continent. They were dredging out these canals, creating them, right? They were building railroads across the country, across the wilderness. They had, just imagine all the trees that they had to cut down. I don't know if you've been across the country, especially on the East Coast. There are so many flipping trees everywhere. I just moved out to Florida and drove across. And it was like, there was like a line in the sand in the middle of Texas where it just became all forest. And driving through the northern part of Florida, it was just trees everywhere. I'm like, they didn't have chainsaws. They didn't have electric tools. They were cutting all these trees down by hand and creating railroads across the entire country. And oh my goodness, they brought light to all the world through electricity, right? And then they flew planes. They brought ships over, and then we were able to fly planes back to Europe. Created the flight, right? And so these ideas, you listen, and he goes into such depth on here's how it worked, and here was the first guy, and here's how he felt, and the second guy, here's how he felt, but he got a little better, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and finally this 10th guy, he broke through, and this 20th guy, he was able to expound on it, and all of them, they were each making a business out of it. It wasn't the government coming in and saying, we're going to dredge out these rivers, we're gonna do this flight, we're going to do this. They tried, they failed over and over again. He gives those examples as well. But then when it was a profit-seeking business, they were able to say, okay, I know that if I make this possible, then I'm going to get this kind of return from it. I don't care what happens. I'm going to make this happen. And they would find a way to make it happen. And so you too will be inspired by this book 1,000 times just by hearing all these stories, okay? My challenge to you is go ahead and download this book. I have the link below. You can either listen to it or read it. I love to listen to books myself, but read it or listen to it this week and let me know how it goes. And my ongoing challenge is read one educational book every single week. I'm not talking about Desperate Housewives or that vampire one with the love stories. Not those books. Educational books that will make you become a better person, a better entrepreneur, a better salesman, right? And be able to grow your business. So go ahead, take the challenge. If you need my full book list, I have that linked below as well. Until next time, best wishes.